Welcome to Catalyst. We're living through a wild moment in history right now. The power structures that built our current modern era are crumbling all around us, and we don't know what the future is going to look like. But in the uncertainty of our current moment, we have an opportunity to build something better. Out of the destruction that we see all around us all the time, something is going to grow. And it's my feeling that if we understand the history that brought us to this modern era and the failings of the system as it stands, we can actually build something more robust for our future. It is not useful for us to try to It's time for us to lay our modern era to rest and start working towards a more equitable future for all of us. In her book, Hospicing Modernity, Vanessa Machado de Oliveira writes, quote, "Modernity is a single story of progress, development, human evolution, and civilization as it is omnipresent. Modernity is full of paradoxes, of war and humanitarian support, of ongoing colonialism and reconciliation, of imperialism and education, of poverty creation and alleviation, and of exponential growth and sustainability. Whether you or I identify with or are critical of it, it still conditions what and how we feel, desire, relate, hope, and imagine. Although modernity always sees itself and behaves as if young, it has grown old and is facing its end." It is with this conceptualization of modernity that I would like to introduce you to a woman that is very meaningful to me. She has known me for my entire life and has served as a great source of inspiration for engaging in the work that is bringing you this video series and the project that I will be exploring with it. She's an individual with a great deal of perspective on our global power structures because she has spent the last 40 years in international development in an effort to heal the scars of colonialism and push us into a better present. She also happens to be my aunt, which is the entire reason I'm fortunate enough to be able to sit down with her and have this conversation and share it with you. I could speak at length about the regard that I hold for Marcie, but I would rather give her the opportunity to speak to you directly and earn that regard from you on her own.
So what information do you want from me about who I am?
Let's start with your name.
Okay, my name is Marcie Rubardt. I spent 40 years working in international health, and for 20 of those years I considered that I commuted to the airport because I worked out of my office at home when I was at home, but I probably spent a quarter to a third of my time working overseas. A lot changed in 40 years. When we first went to Congo in the Peace Corps with my husband, there were no clinics, there was barely a hospital, and for quite a few years, the capacity of people in the countries where I was working was limited by the limited education system when they were under colonial control. And now, when I retired, the majority of colleagues that I were working with were MD MPHs. They were highly trained and made great partners for taking over the work that I had started 40 years ago. So in that respect, I found it very encouraging. I guess that's where I would start for who I am and where I came from.
I think that's a pretty good start.
I think it's fair to say, even though I don't know what the content is, that any of the peace negotiations that we hear about in the news, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Middle East and Yemen and Syria and I don't know whom, Pakistan, I mean, these conflicts keep simmering up. And they keep simmering up because we never get to any real reconciliation or solution to the problem. We only get to how do we sort of smooth it over enough so that we can continue to maintain the status quo. And that was even more clearly obvious in Africa, where we were in Africa in the late 70s. The wave of independence from the colonizers was the early 60s. So it had only been less than 20 years since these countries had been liberated from the colonizers, which is why they didn't have education systems, they didn't have government systems, and all the borders were inherited based on the flow of natural resources. The oil, the gold, the lumber, the whatever. All of the borders were based on how Belgium and the UK and France had decided that they needed to divide up the continent according to their fairness. And I don't know enough about history to know how that happened and why this one ended up Portuguese and that one ended up British, but it was pretty clear to me that the Africans didn't have much say about that. And I think that we, to this day, have inherited borders that were determined by white colonizers interested in wealth. And they were not to the benefit of the people who lived there. How do we move beyond colonialism? How do we move beyond land grabbing? How do we move? What is the overlap or the link between land grabbing, resource extraction, and sustainability? We need to rethink how we define the establishment of peace or the resolution of the inconsistent and problematic borders and land grabbing and dominance that we've had over the last several hundred years. I felt uncomfortable with the word reparations because it implies that I owe somebody something. And that then implies that it's my fault or my mistake that I need to make up for. It's so much more than that. It is about privilege and inequality and one up and one down and who holds on to power and who doesn't share power and why we have a right to take space and resources away from people who have a different definition of what a good life is or may have had in the past, a different definition of what a good life is. And how do we think about bringing the world and the planet back into a more equitable and sustainable way of living rather than a increasing consumption of resources and an increasing wealth poverty gap. And there's been an assumption that if I'm on top, it's my right to be on top. There's been a lack of recognition of why I'm on top and why it isn't really a right to be on top, because it's not that I'm better, it's not that I earned it, it's not that I worked harder, it's that I somehow landed with more privilege. And therefore I feel some responsibility to move the world back into more of a sustainable, equitable way of living. And that inevitably means that I will probably pay more than somebody in an African village to do that. But what that looks like is not how will I give cash to somebody in an African village to make up for that. It's how will we, as a society and as a planet and as a world, work in that direction, and how will we commit to that? And it's very subtle. You know, I was having the conversation about my appreciated tech stock with somebody last night, and I was saying, so I really didn't deserve it. I should look for ways to use it to give away. And he says, no, don't go too far. You know, you can enjoy it. And so it comes up in really subtle ways of, wait a minute, you've got it, enjoy it. You were lucky. So what? Well, the planet can't afford it. And so it's a gradual shift. You know, that, my takeaway from that, even though the guy that was saying it was very politically engaged, he's working on immigrant rights work, he lives pretty modestly, but his initial frame was, you've got it, enjoy it. And I've reached the point where my frame is, I've got it, I need to think about how to use it. So that's a shift from entitlement and towards responsibility. For a long time, I was blind to the assumptions about white privilege. That's just the way things were for me. And as I've dug deeper into privilege and deeper into international development, I've realized that the reality for 400 years, or maybe even 600 years, you know, somewhere back to medieval times, when we left tribalism and came back into a more established society, modernity has implied some people higher than others, some people more dominant than others, some people with more privilege, more wealth. So terms like colonialism, exploitation, racism, inequality are all part of the modernity that the society that we've been living in for 400 or 500 or 600 years. The conclusion in my mind is that the modernity, or the life that we've been living, the framework we've been living in, is not sustainable. It is obsolete. And if we carry that further, then nations are obsolete. Washington, D.C. is not functioning. If we really look critically at what are our assumptions in this society and in this life, and are they working? Basically, none of them are working right now. They are all careening towards more and more destruction, whether it's more war, whether it's more poverty, whether it's more homelessness, whether it's more global warming, whether it's weather change and tides and floods and deaths. We have capitalized sustainability, and we have put a price on carbon emissions. And if I pay for my carbon footprint, then I have a right to increase my carbon footprint in the world. And at least in our society, people with money are justifying their use of their carbon, the expansion of their carbon footprint, if they pay for it, with the assumption that if I pay money, we can fix our overconsumption of the world's resources. And so I think that the colonial subjugation mentality has carried over now into our overall planetary crisis. And so again, we won't be able to reconcile our overuse of the planet resources if we don't reconcile our sense of privilege and our sense of right to the planet's resources. We're looking at this planet cannot continue to support 8 billion people, plus, in the structures that we've currently got working. That's kind of what post-modernity means. At this point, it isn't about fixing anything in our current framework. Our current framework, I believe, is so broken that we're not going to be able to fix it. That until we jump out and say, this isn't working, so now what? We're going to be always stuck with one foot pulling us back into the power and wealth and consumption assumptions that we make. We need to be able to jump out of that and jump back into a smaller scale, a scale that's more local, a scale that takes human people in my immediate orbit more into account. Now, I recognize that one of the slippery slope things about that then becomes, how do we not idealize the way things used to be? Or how do we not idealize what Indigenous people used to be? Because none of us has the answer to today's challenges from our past. Our past is our past. It's water under the bridge. It's left behind. It's how do we learn from our diverse global experience, and how do we begin to work together at a local level or a whatever level that makes sense to be more sustainable and be more equitable. So for me, sustainability and equitable justice are really the drivers in this. I think it will depend on getting back in touch with nature and being back in balance with nature, just as it is being back in balance with rich people and poor people. How do we begin to recreate that post-modernity? But it won't be starting with the assumptions that we have today. I use the term being with whoever shows up in front of me, being present for. And if I can listen, and if we can have this kind of conversation with whoever shows up in front of me, regardless of their color, regardless of their economic status, regardless of their education status, most people have thoughts about this stuff. You know, people are not ignorant of the problems that this planet is facing at the moment. It isn't a definition of what that other voice says or how they see the world, but we desperately need diversity if we are going to come out of modernity. Because in fact, modernity has been dominated by the white privileged North. And if we can just turn around and say, we need those other voices, we need those other perspectives, whether it's rich, poor, whether it's native, non-native, whether it's living in the Amazon jungle or not, we need those voices. People often think about indigenous practices or values and cultures as being the opposite of white, northern, civilized culture and values. And I think it's an interesting twist to think about, what does tribalism mean? And is tribalism pro or anti-diversity? And my experience in Africa was that there was strong tribalism. Tribalism probably drove much of the way African society was built. And the tribes went to war against each other. At one point, a health committee from a village where some fellow Peace Corps volunteers were working were going to come visit the health committee in the village where my husband and I were working. And the initial response from those people was that they didn't dare come visit our village because they might be killed because it was a different tribe, which we thought was really strange. But that was the very deep understanding of the way tribalism was governing society in Africa. And it was very anti-diversity in that case. And I think that much of the Western world slips into creating we, they, other, me, we're different, looking at our differences, and that precludes our ability to see the extreme commonalities that we have and how those subtle differences can enhance my understanding of my reality through that difference. So let me start a little bit with the lens that I feel like I brought to my development work. And one element was the absolute importance of and respect for diversity, and being very walking a line between whether or not my perspective was right and was I trying to change people's cultural context and perspective versus how I was honoring or respecting people's cultural diversity. And particularly working in reproductive health later in my career, that was quite a sensitive issue because some of the values were around women's rights, around reproductive choice, around homosexuality, and inherent in many of the cultures that I worked in, those were not options. And so I had a position by being an outsider where I could raise some of those questions and challenge some of those values, versus was I an outsider that came in and decided this is what you should do, or whatever you do is right. I have no business challenging your values and your whatever. And at the end of the day, I came down on that with when 50% of the population does not have rights, I have a job to at least raise that question or challenge those assumptions. But it's not a given. And, when does colonialism become, or when does challenging people's assumptions become colonial, become exporting my American values around women's liberation? I don't know the answer to that. And in a lot of my work years, I used to describe it as being this feeling in my stomach, right, kind of in my lower belly. And if that felt okay, I moved forward with it. And if I was kind of uncomfortable with that, I backed off. And I think that the other way that piece manifests itself is this about me? Or is this about my values? Or is this about what I think should happen? Or is this really about some kind of more fundamental human right issue? And my head could make all kinds of stories up about that. but my belly was usually right. I was working in a village in Ethiopia where we were assessing people's values around teen sex and teen pregnancy. And we worked with cognitive dissonance because people could, in the same breath, say, my granddaughter should not be having sex, but we don't want teen pregnancy. And if you asked people on an individual, small group, focus group, community discussion level to start unpacking those, the conclusion of the conversation was, my granddaughter needs to use family planning because she is living in a boarding school in the capital city and I want her to finish school. Never mind that she's not married. And the old man goes off to the family planning clinic, or goes off to the clinic to encourage them to give family planning to teen girls. One day, social change can happen fast when everything lines up. But that didn't come from a multinational intervention with a billboard that says young girls should use family planning. It came from that immediate connection that said, wait a minute, she's my granddaughter and I want her to finish school. It's not to say one is more right than the other, but those are the kinds of choices that we have and have had to make, and the trade-offs that you get for one or the other. On a much smaller scale, when we were in Peace Corps in Zaire, we brought measles vaccine to the village for the first time that they had ever had anything healthcare. And we happened to be working in conjunction with an agriculture project with USAID, so we had the capacity to bring cold boxes because we had freezers in town, and we were able to bring measles vaccination out. And there's never been a more clear cause and effect in any impact measurement that I have done than that, where people came up to us after that year and said, last year and every year kids used to die from measles. This year, nobody died. And it was an absolutely uncomplicated intervention. There were no intervening factors. There were no other variables because the environment was so poor and so scarce that the only difference from last year to this year was we had measles vaccine this year. Is that because we told them, or is that because people see the benefits? And if we tell people they need to use family planning, or they need to have a vaccination, or they need a COVID vaccine, or whatever, people will tend to shrug their shoulders. They may comply, they may not comply, but they're unlikely to be convinced, and they're unlikely to really go to bat for that intervention. But if people have the opportunity to directly and personally experience the benefit of those things, then they internalize it. But ownership is important, capacity is important, and some level of local responsibility is important. The program is not mine, it is theirs. And I may have come with an idea. The grace and humbleness with which I show up makes a big difference. Is it their idea or is it my idea? Or am I kind of planting a seed and it picks up or it doesn't pick up? But local ownership and experience is essential. If we go back to the Zairean village, they are the ones who saw the benefit of the measles vaccine. And they are the ones who then say, we want this in our village. It wasn't some newfangled Peace Corps idea. And how we make that transition, because the year before we came, they didn't even know measles vaccine existed. So it's not like they can raise their hand and say, I want measles vaccine, because they didn't know. But if I'm the one that says, you want measles vaccine, they're going to say, what do you mean? You're going to poke my kids? You've got to find some way to walk in between that. So, and I have to be ready to hand over the control and the responsibility and the interest to people when they are ready to go. And I think it's fair to say that even the stuff that we did wrong in development, it wasn't black and white. You know, there were plenty of people working inside USAID who were ex-Peace Corps volunteers, who wanted to make the world a better place, thought they could do it. There used to be a conversation about, well, do you change USAID from inside or from outside? And so it's how do you do the job that your belly says you need to do in the context of a structure and a resource flow that puts America first. And USAID did a lot of really good work. I think we are seeing a tremendous amount of suffering with the sudden removal of USAID in the last few months. But America was first. And there's been books written on it that 75 cents on every American dollar actually came back to the US. We had to buy American cars with American money. We could not buy whatever cars were locally sold. We had to do project evaluations with US personnel. You couldn't hire a local person to evaluate the project. That was my bread and butter for some years as a consultant, was doing those evaluations. So it's not black and white, because I think I did good evaluations. And I did not go in telling people, I did not go in evaluating people. I went in guiding people to evaluate themselves. But it's not black and white. It's messy. I think the money trail has led to corruption in places where it might not otherwise have manifested. Good people still say, well, what about my per diem? Or I'm going to sign up for this workshop because I'll get fancy per diem for it. Or I will take half of these medications home and I'll sell them in my private clinic. They're still getting out to people, but I will sell them and I will get the money. So money and the money trail in these programs gets tangled up with ownership. And it would be cleanest if we would turn the money over to, but programs follow the money, people follow the money, they don't necessarily follow the programs. And that gets messy. So this is kind of the so what of the examples that we've been talking about. At the end of the day, health development overseas was social change. And I am trying to think about, okay, so 2025 in the world, what do we do? What have we learned? What do we do? How do we get out of the modernity as we know it and into some kind of new model for survival? And there are kind of three frameworks that I work from. The first one is called the Three Horizons. And this is a framework that I have found really useful because it is actually pretty simple. we have a horizon that we're living in today, 2025. There are some good things, there are some bad things, there are some things that need to change. But we can choose, we can take the challenge to say, what from 2025 do we want to bring with us? It's not a question of fixing it. It's not a question of changing it. It's a question of transforming into a new reality. But there may be some good pieces. There may be some things we don't just want to dump the baby out with the bathwater. So that's Horizon 1. What in 2025 do we want at the end of the day? Horizon 3 is, where do we want to be? Where are we going? And along about 2015 or 2016, when we got Trump the first time around, and colleagues and friends of mine clicked into flip the House in 2018, take the presidency back in 2020, my reaction was, no, that's not what this is about. That is going back and how do we fix Washington, D.C.? We cannot fix Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. should be dead and gone. It's not working in the same way that we have talked about borders being obsolete, countries being obsolete. America, as I know it, is obsolete and unsustainable. So what do we want when we get out of this dark time right now? What does a positive, compassionate, sustainable, just world look like in 2070? That's the third horizon. And then the second horizon is the one I'm still struggling with, of what are the pieces in between that get us from today to 2070. And I'm making progress on that. I think this kind of conversation and this kind of work is part of it. I have kind of thought, oh, we're in the first horizon. What are we going to do to be working in the second horizon? And a friend of mine pointed out to me that there's already many actions happening in the second horizon. There are people stepping up and creating alternatives to the assumptions we make when we're stuck in the old Western way of thinking. So I guess if we're thinking about the third horizon and how far it is or how far it feels from today, we need to live and work with uncertainty, because we don't know how we're going to get to the third horizon. We don't really even know what the third horizon is. The only thing that I feel like I know is that today doesn't work. So what does it take, I think, is what we're talking about, to work with chaos? And what are the skills? What is the framework that allows us to see opportunity instead of fear in that chaos? Because when the stock market goes crazy, or when Trump gets elected, or when any number of other chaotic things happen, my immediate response is to be afraid. I'm going to lose what I have. I'm not going to be able to take care of my kids. I'm not going to be able to go to work anymore because I'm going to lose my job. And I have a friend, the friend I mentioned that lost his job 10 weeks ago, he started planning for that the day after Trump was elected. And he has had a great 10 weeks as he has kind of come out of it and been ready to say, so what next? And he has a partner who lost his job 3 weeks ago, I think, who didn't have that kind of preparation, didn't come out of it feeling like that, and is feeling quite terrified. The two people with similar circumstances, very different frame for working with those circumstances. So what does it take to be that first person? It takes a certain amount of centeredness. It takes a certain amount of resilience. It takes a body awareness of what fear is, I think, because if fear takes over, then we slip into chaos. But if we can say, okay, yes, I'm afraid, but there are these other feelings. This fear will pass. Things do work out. And you can convince people, I can convince myself in my mind things will work out. But I can also work on being aware in my body of what it feels like when things can work out. This could be a great opportunity. A common comment at some of the protests that have happened recently is, it's so great to be out here with other people like this. We've got 75,000 people marching. That is resilience. That is creating opportunity out of the chaos, because we are not alone. We are connected. That doesn't give us an answer that says, so what are we going to do about Washington, D.C. tomorrow? But it does give us a sense of strength and power and opportunity and hope. These incremental ways of expanding the opportunity move us towards the second horizon or the third horizon, move us out of being stuck in, oh, we need to go back and put USAID back on the ground and put Congress back in place and put we've got to put Democrats on the Supreme Court. Will any of those really change what needs to happen? But the rapid destruction of those institutions does offer us an opportunity to say, okay, so what do we want 2070 to look like? And how are we not going to have this knee-jerk response that says, oh, we want to put it all back like it was? Because we don't really want to put it all back like it was. We have a growing wealth-poverty divide. We have a growing north-south divide. We have a growing number of people in migration for economic violence or climate reasons and/or climate reasons. We don't want to put that back in place. We need something really different. In order to achieve transformation, we need to get off the road and find the cracks. We need to not just stay on the path that we think we're on. We need to explore and be open to what else may come up or what other alternatives may present. And I've actually lived that kind of way with some somewhat different language of how do I stay in touch with the opportunities that are in my peripheral vision. If I am too focused on this is the way it needs to be and this is where I've got to go, and if I think I'm really certain, I will miss the opportunities that present. But if I pay attention to what comes in from the sidelines, and this is usually the way I've gotten jobs over time, is something kind of goes, whoop, and I go, oh, that's an opportunity, sure. Is paying attention to what is not necessarily on that straight path, but what is consistent with my values and my goals and my image of what the world might be. I also bring 40 years of Buddhist meditation spiritual practice to this work. And when I have talked about taking myself out of the center, when I have talked about being true to my belly, those concepts are coming from 40 years of a meditation practice and a spiritual practice. That is the true north for the work I am doing, for the language I am using, and for my goals. It's that practice that enables me to have this conversation right now, because this is not a conversation from my head. This is a conversation from my gut and from my heart. And when I am at the party last night, or when I am talking to my kids, or when I am talking to an immigrant at the food bank in Spanish, it's not my head that's talking to those people. It's my heart and my gut, and that sense of what that lighthouse is for 2070 is not up here. That sense for what that lighthouse needs to be is that sense of being connection. It isn't even just human. It's connection to nature. It's connection to all living beings. It's certainly connection to all different colors of human beings. That, they are not deportees. They are human beings. And, wow, I'm going to cry at that. That's so basic and so essential to what needs to drive all of this. And my experience then is that almost no matter who I'm talking to, if I am talking with them in this kind of space, the conversation develops in this kind of real way, because it's not about me and it's not about what I'm doing. It's about something that resonates with what we all feel. And that's my spiritual practice. But I think we need to come back to what I did learn overseas, and that is the importance of human connection, the importance of working together, the importance of working locally, and the importance of doing both of those kind of in the context of greater human values. And I recently heard a discussion that talked about the difference between equality and fairness, because we don't want to put equality out there as something we're aspiring to. We don't want everybody to be the same. We want everybody to have a fair and equal opportunity for themselves and to realize themselves within the context of their lives and our global life. And the only way we're going to do that is by reasserting or refinding our common humanity and inherently accepting the uncertainty that is part of that. And somehow then the overwhelming shift towards greed and power will lose its strength, I think. But all of those are pretty big ifs right now, but I really do think that human connection and smaller scale and reaching out to 75,000 people in the street in Seattle, we've got close to 1 million people rising in this country. We've got a world that is in change. And if we can build small scale from the bottom up, that's how we will make a difference in a bigger way. It won't be because I go to Washington, D.C. and work from the bottom down. Now, that said, some people have had some pretty honorable opportunities to make bigger splashes. But I can't wait for that for me. I have to just put one foot in front of the other and take the opportunity to make this film and reach out to you. And doing that in lots of small steps and lots of small ways will, I believe, move us in the direction we need to go. So how do we do this? How do we take these three elements of spirituality and community and diversity and turn it into making the world a better place today? Or turn it into the chaos that we're searching, for which we're searching a path out? And I think my first answer to that, I even less have answers for this, but I think my first answer for that is do something. Reach out, connect with somebody around something that you care about. It can be a small act. It doesn't have to be strategic. You don't have to think about which is more important than what, but do something that you care about. Do something that you're passionate about, and do something that looks to you like it makes the world a better place. What I keep coming back to is it isn't about the outcome, it's about the process. And by engaging in the process, we achieve the outcome. It is not an excuse to not take action just because I don't know if it's going to make a difference. I need to take action because it is the right thing to do, and I know that in my belly. And I know that in the way that I am able to show up for somebody that's in front of me. And what's going to come of that, and whether it's really going to make a difference at the end of the day, that's not what counts.
I want to thank Marcie again for agreeing to participate in this project and for serving as a catalyst that actually inspired this project to be something that I invested my time in anyway. In the coordination process leading up to our recording sessions, it became apparent to me that this was the first step in a much larger project that I don't know the full scope and scale of, but I feel is necessary to engage in. And as Marcie pointed out, it is not the end result that is important, it is the process. I take quite a bit of inspiration from that, and I hope that you do as well. If anything that was said during this interview sparked any interest in you or any inspiration to get out and do something with your time and your energy, I hope that you nurture that spark. Whether that's small things like building stronger bonds in your local community, hanging out with people that need a boost right now, or participating in city council meetings, whatever it is that you can do to affect a positive change, I encourage you to go do it. We can all change the world around us in small ways, and those small ways do aggregate into larger results. There are so many of us. We can move mountains if we do it one handful at a time. If you want to see more of this interview with Marcie, you can gain access to the full-length interview by joining my Patreon. Unfortunately, I still need to exchange money for food, gas, and electricity to keep myself going while I do this work. So receiving donations from the community who appreciate the fact that this project exists is how I'm going to afford to keep this whole endeavor afloat. If you can't afford to financially support this project, maybe drop a like or a comment to help convince our AI overlords that this video is worth passing the gatekeepers of the internet attention economy. Thank you for watching.